Please welcome the Executive Chairman of the Board of Air Lease Corporation, Stephen Udvar-Hazy, in conversation with Skift Editor-in-Chief Tom Lowry and Airline Weekly Editor Madhu Unnikrishnan.
Hi, Steve. Welcome to Skift Aviation Forum.
Good morning. It's nice to be here.
Thank you very much and for agreeing to be double teamed. Madhu and I are usually pretty good dance partners, so we'll try not to step on each other's toes today.
Well, don't be too tough on me.
So you've been through your fair share of highs and lows. Perhaps none as low as what we're seeing right now. What do you see, or how do you see aviation returning to a reliable pattern of growth?
Well, it's really interesting because if you map out the industry since after World War II, you have periods of growth, and then you have what I call these earthquakes that are usually caused by external events, either geopolitical, massive changes in energy prices, regulatory changes like we had the deregulation in 1978 in the U.S., 9/11. You have these events that are not forecastable by the airlines. So you have growth periods, and then you have a sudden sort of a massive shock to the industry, and then there's recovery. The recovery this time is a little more complex than the ones before. Like when we had the previous SARS crisis, which mainly affected Asia and was much more limited in North America and Europe and the Middle East. This time we have a global pandemic that spread very quickly in the first 3-4 months of 2020 and has really affected the whole air transportation system in a different way than the previous ones. And I think part of that is because it's been so difficult to forecast the road to recovery. And then secondly, technology, like the forum we have today, has in fact eaten into traditional ways of people meeting and doing business and getting together. So to what extent will that again fade and we go back to the old reliable face-to-face, person-to-person encounters? Or will a certain segment of our business activities continue to rely on these digital interactions between business partners? And so what I see as the most challenging to forecast is the recovery of the long-haul intercontinental high-end high-yield business traffic. That's the one that is very difficult for our crystal ball to analyze. I believe that the leisure traffic and discretionary travel will recover fairly rapidly once people have sort of the psychology that it's safe to travel. And that's not just the airplane experience, but the airport experience, hotels, ground transportation, and so forth. It's the whole spectrum of that travel experience. I think that will come back reasonably quickly once we have demonstrated viruses and the statistics on the infections and hospitalizations will take a dramatic decline. Hopefully that will happen in the early part of 2021. But the length of the recovery this time is a different curve than we've had previously. And that's what airlines are struggling with. How quickly do they ramp up their operations, not necessarily to 2019 levels, but even to 70, 80, 85% of where they would have been a year ago. I'm sure you have the same feedback from talking to airlines yourselves.
Well, let me jump in here. So given that you're saying, domestic demand and leisure demand will return more quickly, are there particular regions of the world where you see the sort of rebound occurring more quickly than in others?
Yes, we already had some interesting, let's just call it early signals on that in the summer. And I'll just give you a small example. My wife flew to southern France from Los Angeles via Amsterdam to visit my daughter, who happened to be down in the south coast of France with her family. And on the flight from Los Angeles to Amsterdam, the load factor was about 15% on a 777-300ER.
Huh.
And this was during the middle of the summer.
Wow.
15% load factor, 100% load factor in the cargo holds.
Right.
So all the pallet positions were taken up. And the fact that there were fewer passengers meant that the cargo space normally allocated to baggage was now available for revenue cargo.
Right. Huh.
She gets to Amsterdam and switched to a Transavia Netherlands 737-800 and flew from Amsterdam to Nice, and there was 100% load factor.
Passenger load factor.
100%.
Huh.
Every seat was taken. So that is kind of an interesting contrast.
Yeah.
And this was again in August, so it's the peak travel season. What it showed us that people had this pent up demand, and we've talked to a lot of European airlines. We have more than 50 customers, airlines in Europe that we deal with. We saw this trend starting to develop late May, early June, where there was a lot of pent up demand for people to just get out of their sort of lockdowns and restricted situations. And they wanted to fly down to the Mediterranean. They wanted to go to Palma de Mallorca. They wanted to go to Malaga. They wanted to go to Sicily. They wanted to go to the Greek islands. And there was a surge of traffic. And then starting in late September, early October, when again the circumstances changed, things really started dropping off. There was still strong impetus down to the Canary Islands, but a lot of the other things that looked very promising in July and August died out very quickly. Another situation, I was just talking to the CEO of an Eastern European airline or Central European airline. He said that in terms of his forecasting, he'll only recover maybe 30% of his business traffic to the main business destinations like London, Amsterdam, Paris, whereas his flights to leisure destinations in the Adriatic, the Mediterranean, he thinks will be up to 85% by June of next year. So that again is a contrast that the rate of recovery of the high yield business traffic may be a little more sluggish, a little more sporadic, and more difficult to forecast.
So you mentioned something interesting about your wife's experience, or the flight your wife was on. About 100% of the cargo positions were taken.
Yeah, she sent me photographs from the gate, from the glass window.
Uh-huh.
She sent me photographs of them loading the cargo pallets. I was getting real-time reports.
Do you think that sort of demand is sustainable long term, or do you think it'll fuel more demand for freighters?
Well, you have to remember that more than 2/3 of the air cargo in normal times is carried on passenger aircraft, in the bellies of passenger aircraft, and airplanes like the A350, the 777-300ER, the 787-9, the 787-10, even the A330-300 are really good cargo airplanes.
Right.
When you have a decent passenger load, they really augment the revenue generation of that aircraft. So inasmuch as such a high percentage of the intercontinental scheduled flying has now been curtailed, it makes it look like there's a huge surge in cargo demand. There is a certain amount of that because of all the medical supplies and equipment and even things like uniforms and I mean, there's all kinds of stuff coming out of Asia, which is abnormal. But if you just take the normal cargo flows, that business will still have the majority of the traffic flown by passenger aircraft. So this euphoria now about all cargo airplanes is interesting, but I'm not sure that we're looking at double-digit growth in all cargo airplanes once we have normalization of the passenger fleets, particularly the wide-body passenger fleets.
Right.
Now, to the extent, as I said earlier, that traffic recovery, particularly in the business segment, first class, business class, is slower. That means maybe the frequencies will not be there on these wide-body intercontinental flights. So therefore, the all-cargo airplanes will pick up that delta, that difference. So I think for the next 18 to 24 months, we're going to see a very strong cargo market. And I'm talking about the all-cargo operations.
Right.
But then as things normalize, we should get back to equilibrium.
Steve, let's shift up a little bit and talk about aircraft demand. What are you seeing from your lessors in terms of the split between wide body and narrow body?
Going forward?
Yes.
We have seen a transformational shift, I would say, already in the last 18 months. This started even before the pandemic, where we began to see a shift to the smaller and medium-sized wide bodies and away from the A380, 747, 400, 747-8s, A340-600s. I think the airlines realized that with seasonality in a lot of these long-haul routes, like across the transatlantic, for example, it is difficult to sustain a year-round profitable operation with a 500-600 seat airplane. There's only a limited number of city pairs where that's profitable year-round on a consistent basis. So airlines already began to focus more on frequency, in some cases bypassing their major hubs. And so we saw already a trend toward the, what I would call, say, 250 to 350 seat aircraft. And that trend, I think, was accelerated by the pandemic.
Is there a narrow body that's particularly hot right now?
Yeah, the A321 LR and the XLR, I think, are the from a lessor as an owner of capital goods, I would say, and this is not meaning to be discourteous to Boeing. Right now, I would say the A321 is filling kind of an interesting niche. I'll give you a small example. If you go to FlightAware, and every night before I go to bed, I spend about 10 or 15 minutes looking at all of our customers and seeing what they're flying, what's up in the air, where are they flying. So I look at an airline like Aer Lingus, where they used to operate A330-300 and A330-200 between, say, Dublin and Boston. Now they're flying our A321 Neo LRs.
Huh.
So they've gone from a 300-seat airplane to like, I think it's like 186-seat dual class with the lie flat business class. So does it mean they're making money on that flight coming into the winter? The answer is probably no. They're probably losing a lot less money flying an A321 LR from Dublin to Boston compared to an A330. We're seeing the same thing. We just delivered a A321 LR Neo to SAS. And they will again operate that airplane from Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Oslo across the Atlantic. It almost reminds me of the old DC-862s and 63s, where you now have a single-aisle aircraft, twin-engine aircraft, flying the same kind of missions that the old DC-8s and 707s flew across the Atlantic. It's kind of ironic that in 45, 50 years, we did sort of like a complete turn back to the old days.
Yeah,
Now, I'm not saying that wide bodies are going out of style. I'm just saying that airlines are finding ways to operate the large single-aisle aircraft, particularly the A321neo, in a way that is different than what we've had in the past. Look at the U.S. transcon market. If you look at 25 years ago, the majority of the transcon flights between LA, San Francisco, and New York were L-1011s, DC-10s, and 747s. Today, there are 737-800s, 737-900s, A320s, 757s, and A321s. And it's become a much more a frequency game rather than just having maybe 2 or 3 flights a day with a wide-body DC-10 or L-1011. So it's a very interesting trend where airlines are using their large capacity single-aisle aircraft in markets that were traditionally, much larger airplanes, like the L-1011 and DC-10s back in the 70s and 80s. So they've actually down-gauged in a lot of these markets.
Well, I wanted to ask then, so do you still see the need for a new mid-market aircraft? And do you think do you think Boeing will pull the trigger on it, or has Airbus sort of filled the niche?
Look, I think both companies are working on new technologies. I think there's 2 schools of thought. One is if we use current technology with maybe a slightly improved engine, Boeing could probably build another airplane. Let's call it almost like a quasi 757, large 737 replacement. But once you figure in the capital cost and the R&D cost of developing such an airplane, can it compete with the A321? In other words, even if it's a more efficient airplane and the cash direct operating costs are a little better than the A321, the Airbus single engine family, the investment to build and develop the aircraft has already been essentially recovered. Whereas a brand new airplane, you've got to recover that through the pricing. So I have some serious doubts whether either Boeing or Airbus can design an all-new airplane using current aerodynamic and engine technologies that can have a meaningful, let's call it double-digit economic advantage over what we already have. So what I see evolving is more of a hybrid technology where maybe you use some electric propulsion to augment the latest bypass turbofan engines to reduce the weight of the aircraft, and maybe that electric technology can be used as incremental thrust to reduce the trip fuel burn maybe by 20%. But you really only need that additional power on takeoff and climb. Because once you're at cruise, you really don't need that electric technology, and the airplane can then have a lighter weight power plants and do the job. So I think that's the direction. Almost like we didn't go from all piston engine and diesel cars to all electric cars. There was that transitional period with hybrids that had a smaller gasoline engine and then an electric augmentation engine, like the Prius, for example. So I could see that evolution, and I can tell you that Airbus is working very hard on solutions along those lines. Now, Boeing obviously is distracted, and at this time, I just don't see how the board of Boeing could commit to a $15 billion program until they get over their challenges, not just on the 737 recertification, but also on the 777X, which has turned out to be a difficult one for them financially and at the wrong time for the airline customers. So I think those are 2 big hurdles that Boeing has to deal with. So I personally don't think the board and the leadership in Chicago would write a blank check now to develop a 797.
Now, you mentioned the 777X. I just wanted to ask one follow-up on that. Do you see what kind of market do you see for that airplane when it's finally certified?
Yeah, let me point out something really interesting. The A380 never got a customer in the Americas.
Right.
Think about that.
Right.
We did have kind of a loosey-goosey order back at ILFC for 10 of them, 5 freighters and 5 passenger. And we teamed up with FedEx and UPS, and we're all going to take some freighters. And then we realized it's not a good freighter. It's very difficult to load that upper third deck in adverse weather conditions. So there was never a 380 in the Americas. Nor has there been an order for the 777X in the Americas. Think about that. The North American market is a big chunk of global air transportation. And the 777X, it almost feels to me, this is my personal comment, this is not an Air Lease official statement. It almost feels like an airplane that maybe is ahead of its time. It's like maybe 3 to 5 years out of phase with what the airline industry needs. And so you have most of the 777X customers that have signed up for it almost would wish they would come later and at a lower cost of capital. And Boeing wants those airplanes delivered as quickly as possible to generate the cash flow that they need. So you have the industry saying, let's slow down, let's put the brakes on, the end users, and Boeing would love to get those airplanes out and deliver and generate the cash flows that they need because of the fact that you got 787 production rates have declined, 737 production rates are way down. The 747 freighter is going out of business. So if you look at the revenue profile of Boeing over the next 3 years, they would love to have the 777X get into high gear. But is that realistic with the current state of the airline industry?
Well, let's shift gears a little bit. You're in a global business. I mean, you're by nature, aircraft leasing is a global business.
Yeah.
Trade tensions are rising all over the world, and there are sort of protectionist measures. Just recently, I think this last week, we saw the EU impose tariffs on Boeing aircraft. The end of a long run.
On the 10th, it kicked in on the 10th of November.
Right, the end of a 16-year saga, but still, it's a protectionist measure. I mean, do you see this? Do you see these sort of tensions growing, and how will that affect the leasing business?
think those tensions growing in a political sense, a lot of political fencing going on between the U.S. and Europe and U.S. and particularly China. I don't see there's any winners because even if Europe imposes a 15% tariff on Boeing products going to Europe, a lot of those Boeing products are manufactured in Europe.
Yeah.
A lot of the components, you can have seats, avionics, the CFM Safran joint venture on the engines. The French are 50% partners on the LEAP engine, on the 737 MAX and the Airbus A320-21. So the revenue that the EU would get from the tariff, I think, is far less than the economic damage if Boeing has to reduce production rates because they can't export planes to Europe. And conversely, the U.S. duty on Airbus, the Airbus products have a lot of American-made components.
Right.
And so I'm not sure this is a win-win solution. Now, politically, it does send messages that, people are flexing their muscles. But in terms of the impact on the airline industry and the aerospace industry, I don't think it's helpful. Now, both sides have committed sins. Let's just be honest. I mean, we all know that to create the A380, the 350, there were government grants, there were government loans, there were all kinds of favorable support for the R&D and to set up production, and some loans were forgiven, some are deferred. And then Boeing, conversely, has help from the Defense Department indirectly. They have Washington State, South Carolina, is extremely generous to be able to set up the plant in Charleston for the 787. It's like neither party is innocent. Let's just be honest. But that's all in the past. And now to punish the airline industry and the global aerospace industry that covers hundreds and hundreds of suppliers and is such a key part of the economies of so many countries, I'm not sure this really accomplishes anything constructive.
Steve, let's set aside the challenges of the pandemic for a second. How concerned are you about flight shaming and the green movement impacting demand going forward?
It's terrible. It's almost like we are public enemy number one. Aviation is like destroying the planet. This is their view. When I was a young boy and I would see the contrail of a jet, flying 35,000 feet, I was captured by the romance of aviation, the way it brings people together. It has helped us globalize the world. It's transformed the economies of so many countries. It's created a bigger middle class. It's had such a positive effect. And now when these same politicians in the green parties in Western Europe and Northern Europe look up, oh, these airplanes, they're destroying our civilization. I mean, how ridiculous. Look, unfortunately, this is the movement today. It's a social movement, as if trains don't create any pollution. I mean, even if trains are electric, to make the electricity, to build the infrastructure for trains, tell me there's no pollution involved. Trains are not running on solar power. So the latest aid package to Air France and KLM, you guys I'm sure saw that. There's strings attached. Air France has to abandon a significant chunk of their local, domestic, and regional flying because the government is saying we're going to loan you money to Air France to survive, but you have to cut away all this short-haul operations where people can simply take public transportation, trains. We're seeing the shaming in Sweden, in Scandinavia, where they're saying if you fly, you should be guilty, and you need to go to church and go to confession. It's just, I think the pendulum is swinging too far, and the airlines are too visible. We're not an industry that can hide from the public. We're highly visible. And all of a sudden, airplanes are evil. And they don't realize the economic damage to the world if air transportation is sort of artificially curtailed. I don't think they understand the interdependence of the global economy on air transportation. It's a total lack of reality.
So what I'm hearing is that you do think there's going to be some impact on demand, that some people will not.
Oh, definitely. It's going to have definite impact. And I think if you look at Europe, anything under, say, 300 miles, 500 kilometers is going to be either curtailed or taxed to death. They can even come out with rules where they say any flight that's less than, say, an hour, we're going to impose €100 tax. But if you want to fly from Frankfurt to Toronto, we're only going to impose a €25 tax because you're not going to take a canoe or a rowboat across the Atlantic. So there's ways of destroying short haul travel in Europe through taxation.
Right.
But then the money that's collected for that is not going to help the environment. That's going for other social agendas and giveaways and projects that are, it's like money going down the toilet. So this is very unfortunate, and but I think it's a trend that will accelerate, and it will begin to infiltrate North America, and it will also begin to get into countries like Japan and other advanced nations in Asia. It's unfortunate, but it will have a negative impact on the airline business.
So as we sort of get close to wrapping it up here, Steve, I want to turn back to the pandemic, and through all the ashes of what we've seen for the industry, what gives you hope about aviation through all of this?
Well, look, aviation has changed the world. If we look at the history of this planet, look what has happened since the Wright brothers did their first low flight. I was at a party a little over a year ago, KLM's 100th anniversary. Look at the role of air transportation and the airline industry, how it's changed the world in the last 100 years. So I don't think we can stop it, and certainly the growth will continue. I think the growth will be maybe moderate for the next 18 to 24 months as we go through this recovery. But then I think we're going to get back on track where airline travel will be about double of GDP growth. I don't think there's any way to really stop that.
Have you seen any carriers that particularly impress you with what they've been able to do through all this?
Well, they've all become experts at being beggars. They're beggars for government aid, financial aid. They've mortgaged the kitchen sink. They've been really adept at raising capital, selling their frequent flyer programs, borrowing against slots, borrowing against intellectual property. They've become really good at that. But look, we had an industry that was growing at high single-digit, low double-digit growth since the financial crisis. And I think the airlines were very much chasing market share growth. That also meant they kept a lot of their older airplanes. There was really a much lower rate of retirements since 2008 than what is normal. And all of a sudden we have this pandemic and all the airlines have to readjust. So what happened? We had an accelerated retirement of aircraft that should have progressively been retired in the last 10 years. And so we are going through a massive readjustment, regaging of the industry. And there'll be casualties, and there are casualties, there will be some casualties. But this is a period of transformation. I think it will force airlines to address their labor costs. It's going to force them to look at where can they make money. Every route that they fly is now under the microscope. Whereas before, if we can grow our market share 5%, let's do it. Now I think it's a much more inward-focused re-examination of their strategies, their alliances, and trying to figure out what they're really good at. And I think that's, in a sense, good. It's sad that it took a pandemic to create this environment, of hundreds of billions of dollars of losses. But I'm confident, I'm optimistic the airline industry will emerge out of this, obviously weakened, but the fact that they've been weakened will force them to be better businessmen, better business operators, and run more efficient airlines going forward in the future.
Well, finally, Steve, I have one kind of fun question to ask you.
Please.
It's one I've been burning to ask you since I first interviewed you back in the Singapore Air Show many years ago. And that is, when you were 27 or 28, how did you come up with the idea to lease aircraft and to essentially create an industry?
Yeah, well, I came up with that idea even long before, around 2022.
Oh, wow.
What happened is there was a major migration in the airline industry from propeller airplanes to jets, okay? And that really started, well, the first jet operation was really 1958 with Pan Am 707, BOAC Comet, but that was really just the embryonic phase. But by the mid 60s and then the late 60s, jets became much more visible, and the writing was on the wall. And what I recognized as I was going to the university here in California is that the airline industry did not have the financial capacity or the balance sheets to transition from low-cost propeller planes to jets. You went from an era where say a DC-6 would cost $300,000 or $400,000, and a brand new 727-100 was $4.5–5 million. So in my mind, I was saying, how do airlines modernize their fleets, going from these very romantic and beautiful constellations and DC-6s and Convairs and Viscounts? How do they get to this next level? And as I looked at the landscape, I realized the airline industry does not have, at that point in time, the capital or the ability to make that transition. So I came to the conclusion that the US airlines had lots of avenues to financing because the US capital markets, stock market, insurance companies, debt markets were much more developed, much more advanced. But as you go outside the US, unless you were a government-owned airline with government guarantees, airlines had limited access to capital. So my idea was, just like in leasing cars, leasing trucks, why don't we invent a leasing platform that enables an airline to go from a DC-6 to a 737-200 or to a DC-9 and do it in an affordable fashion. And that was really the spark that led me to think that it was a good idea to, instead of starting an airline, which I did at the age of 20, why don't we get into the leasing business at the age of 25?
Well, there's one story that's floating around that I just want to hear if it's true or not. And is it true that the first office number you had for ILFC was an LA phone booth?
Yes. Well, the first office was the trunk of my 1956 Oldsmobile. And because I was a beach lifeguard, that's how I made money in the summers, working for the LA County. And then I would take the trunk of my car and I would put airline files and airline magazines there. That was the first office of ILFC. And in those days, we didn't have mobile phones.
Right.
So the telephone booth with the coins was the way of communicating, and also Western Union telegrams. And that was a great way to hide my age. So I would approach airlines and say, I've got a great fleet plan. I've got these ideas about changing route structure. They had no idea I was like 22, 23 years old because I was sending Western Union telegrams. This is long before emails and the technology we're enjoying today. So all stories are true.
Wow. Well, I've been wanting to ask that for many years.
Yeah, you got to start somewhere.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope we can do this again sometime in person in the future.
Yeah, let's do it. And I wanted to tell you, I really enjoy reading your weekly summary, and you guys do a really good job on sort of a holistic overview of the issues and challenges that the industry faces. So it's very professional.
Thank you for being a fan of Airline Weekly. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much.